Hello everyone, and welcome to week 6 of Intro to American Studies. This is the first week of our second unit, which will add gender and sexuality to our discussions of race and ethnicity from Unit 1. So most importantly, note that there is a new question to answer in your weekly reflections. So each week you'll still be answering the basic question that we've been answering already about how the reading challenges or expands your understanding of America, but you'll also answer a second question, which is, to what degree is the author's analysis intersectional? Which means that it incorporates multiple aspects of identity, such as race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality and class and age, ability, citizenship, etc. It doesn't have to be all of these things, but multiple. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So before you read the reading for this week, it's important that you watch Kimberly Crenshaw's video on the urgency of intersectionality, which is when you first open Unit 2, it should be right there. So watch that video first so you understand this idea of intersectionality, which you'll have to talk about in each reflection for this unit and for the next unit. The video is about 20 minutes long, but you only need to watch the first 12 minutes. And in fact, a warning that after 12 minutes, the end of the video does talk about police brutality of black women, and understandably, if you are not feeling up to watching or hearing more about that topic, then you definitely want to stop watching at minute 12. But the first 12 minutes are really important to watch, so please do that first. So there is a lot to cover this week because it's a new unit, so I'll try to talk briefly both about this idea of intersectionality and the reading. But if you have any questions, please do either include them in your reflection or email me directly. This is complicated material, so it's totally understandable if you have questions about it. So in terms of the basic idea of intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer and a legal scholar, and she came up with this term intersectionality in 1989 to describe the double discrimination of racism and sexism that is faced by black women. And over the past 3 decades, scholars and activists have expanded the use of the term to describe the multiple layers of discrimination faced by people based on all sorts of aspects of identity, as I listed it earlier. So not just race and gender, but also age, class, ability, citizenship, etc. So the basic idea of intersectionality is that we cannot accurately understand anyone's experience based on one aspect of their identity alone. So, for example, going back to the Muhammad reading from week 3, as we discussed then, this was an excellent example or analysis of how black people came to be seen as innately criminal, and how this idea of black criminality has been used to justify racist policies over the past century plus. However, one could argue that a problem with Muhammad's book is that it is not intersectional, right? It does not deeply look at multiple aspects of identity. It really only looks at race. So an intersectional critique of Muhammad's book is to ask, well, hey Muhammad, what about gender? How do black people who are women experience this idea of black criminality differently? What about sexuality? How about black people who are gay? Or what about class? What about black people who are working class versus middle class, and they may be criminalized differently? What about citizenship? Black people who are undocumented versus US citizens. So you could go on and on asking about how all of these multiple aspects of identity and their interrelation, shape how different black people experience the criminal legal system differently. So when you're answering this new question, what I want you to do is just to briefly explain how the author of the reading does or does not consider multiple aspects of identity. So for example, if we had been answering this question for the first unit, and you were answering it with regard to the Muhammad reading, you might say something like, Muhammad only really considers race in his analysis. He does not consider other aspects of identity, such as gender or sexuality or class. Boom, period. So this can just be a sentence or two, right, for this new question. And if you're unsure about it, that's totally okay, totally understandable. Especially at first, this may be a new concept for some of you. And we'll be practicing, right, how to use this term every week for the rest of the semester. So now on to the Miles reading. So 2 quick notes about it. So one is that I noticed it looks like it's really long, right? It looks like it's 50 plus pages. That is not true. It's only 28 pages. The rest is pictures and notes, and the text is actually pretty big because it's from a digital ebook, so it's really not a super long reading. And I included the pictures because I thought it could be cool to actually see, some of the people Miles is talking about. So don't be scared away by the page count. This is actually one of my favorite readings of the semester, so I hope you really dig in and enjoy it. Secondly, a trigger warning. The reading does talk about sexual abuse, particularly of Black women. It talks also about the trauma of Black motherhood under racial oppression, including the death of Black children. So just be warned that those topics may bring up particularly painful stuff for some of you. Alright, so why did I choose this book? Basically for 2 reasons. So one is that it focuses on the Cherokee Nation. And one of the fundamental issues with the idea of America, and therefore American studies, is the tendency to erase those who were here before European settlement, such as the Cherokee. So very key basic background information is to understand that before European settlement, right, this continent was inhabited by the people of numerous tribal nations, and that over time European settlers murdered most of these indigenous people and then forcibly removed those who remained from their native territories to the least desirable lands, generally in sort of the middle of the country, or middle of the continent, what became the country. So the first part of Miles's book, which the part we're reading from takes place in the Cherokee Nation in the late 18th and 19th century, which was located in the southeast of the continent, what is now known as Georgia-ish, near there. And then the second part of her book, which we're not looking at, but you're encouraged to if you're interested, takes place after the forcible removal of the Cherokee from the southeast to the middle of the continent near what is known today as Oklahoma. So the first reason, right, I chose the book is so that we do not, right, forget about or erase, right, the experiences of those who were here before European settlement and who are still here, though unfortunately in smaller numbers and in many cases not in their native lands. The second reason I chose the book is because it is a great example of an intersectional approach to scholarship, right, which is the whole focus, right, of this second unit. So Miles is not simply looking at the Cherokee experience, right? She's not just talking about Cherokee people in general. She's not even just looking at the relationship between Cherokee people and Black people. She's looking at one particular Cherokee Black family in which the mother was an enslaved Black woman held by, right, the Cherokee family. And therefore, she's asking how slavery and colonization and gender and the sexual relations of the family are all, right, intertwined and manifesting, right, in this one family and in other families, right, of this time. So before I even read this book, just knowing what it was about challenged my understanding of America, because I didn't even know that Cherokee families held enslaved Black people in bondage, or that Cherokee black families existed, quite frankly, right? That was my own ignorance before, right, coming across this book. And I'm asking you to read the preface to the book, which is just a few pages, because in it, Miles talks about how controversial it was for her to even ask these questions and write this book. And it wasn't just white people who didn't want to keep the nation's sins, right, from being discussed, but also from black people and Native people who wanted, in many cases, to keep their histories separate so as not to complicate their own movements for justice. So just a really interesting example of how complicated, right, doing this sort of work can be in contemporary, right, political context. And then I'm having you read chapter 3 because it focuses on these complex gender and sexual dynamics of this family. So chapter 3 discusses sort of 3 main topics and then tries to tie it all together when talking about the experience of a woman named Doll, who was an enslaved black woman who also became the wife, right, of this Cherokee man named Shoeboots. So first, Miles talks about more generally how the sexual assault of enslaved black women was a fundamental component of the system of American slavery. So slaveholders wrote laws that decreed that slave status was inherited through the mother. So that meant that if you were considered enslaved, you had a child, by default your child is now considered to be enslaved. And then slaveholders used their power to force black women to reproduce, which would therefore then create more enslaved people and therefore more free labor for them to profit off of. Additionally, slaveholders could do what they themselves wanted sexually with black women. And these women had no recourse legally, right, to defend themselves. So it's important to understand, right, the distinctions, therefore, between, right, how white women in this era experienced their own gender and sexual oppression versus black women. Because at this time, right, the law did protect white women to a degree from sexual assault, right? They did have recourse to the law, and white women's children were not considered to be enslaved. So the idea of intersectionality does not just mean, well, black women are oppressed as black people and they're oppressed as women. It means that black women are actually specifically oppressed in unique ways as black women, right? In ways that are not necessarily comparable to how white women or women of other, right, racial ethnic backgrounds are oppressed. Secondly, Miles talks about the difference between the vulnerability of enslaved black people under U.S. law versus within the Cherokee Nation, right? So understand that the Cherokee Nation, then and technically now, right, is a sovereign nation under which U.S. law does not apply, right? This is technically a separate country, more or less, right, within the bounds, right, geographic bounds of the United States. So Miles shows how under Cherokee law, right, kinship, meaning family relationships, and particularly clan status, was the predominant, right, political ordering system. So therefore, Doll, right, who's Shoeboots' enslaved black wife, was still a vulnerable person in the Cherokee Nation, but it wasn't because of her race per se, right? It wasn't because she was black, which is why she would have been vulnerable under U.S. law. In the Cherokee Nation, she was vulnerable because she was not a member of a Cherokee clan, right? And therefore, the ways in which clan status dictated, right, how people were protected legally, right, did not apply to her. And Miles shows by contrast how in some cases black people were actually adopted into Cherokee clans, and then they would have been treated like any other Cherokee person, right? Which is not the way, that couldn't have happened under U.S. law, right? You couldn't, under U.S. law, be, adopted as a white person, and then you wouldn't be vulnerable as racially, right, as a black person, right? Like that's not how U.S. law worked, but Cherokee law, right, worked differently. However, in this case, Doll was not adopted. As far as we know, Doll was not adopted into a Cherokee clan, and so she was still legally vulnerable, but under different terms. And then thirdly, Miles talks about the differences between the social and political and economic rights of white women at the time versus Cherokee women. So while white women lived in a patriarchal society, meaning that white men were legally in control of their families, right, and held power over their wives and female relatives, in Cherokee society, it's matrilineal, meaning that, or matriarchal might be a better term, meaning that women in general were in control of their families and held power over their husbands and male relatives, right? So women held a much higher status in Cherokee society than in U.S. society. So Miles explains, right, sort of all these different dynamics of race and tribe and gender and sexuality, right? So this is what makes her analysis so intersectional. And then she asks how all of this applied to this particular woman, Doll, right, who is the enslaved black wife of Shupins. And she argues that Doll was still racially and sexually oppressed as an enslaved black woman in the Cherokee Nation, but the nature of her oppression was based not on the laws of slavery in the United States, but rather on the laws regarding clan status in the Cherokee Nation. Right? So she was vulnerable not necessarily as a black person, but as a person without clan status. And as a woman, she actually potentially had more rights and autonomy than an enslaved woman in U.S. territory, or even a white, non-enslaved white woman in U.S. territory might have had, because of the privileged status of women in the Cherokee Nation. Right, so you see how, again, this concept of intersectionality is a way of thinking about how all of these layers of identity, right, intersect to create, right, the experience of any one person, in this case, this particular person, Doll, right? So it's insufficient to just ask what her experience would have been like as just a black person, as just a woman, right, or as just a person in the Cherokee Nation, right? That you have to understand all of these complicated dynamics and how they interrelate or intersect to understand what her experience would have been like. Then at the end of the chapter, Miles asks how we can even come to understand the experience of someone like Doll at all, because she and most enslaved people would not have been able to even leave historical records from their point of view. And Miles uses Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which talks about the horrific experiences of motherhood under slavery in the U.S., to help us imagine what Doll's experiences might have been like. So just as a heads up, that like sort of last piece of the chapter, just so it's not confusing, isn't particularly about Doll, right? It's about this novel, Beloved, and Miles is using the novel to help us understand, right, the emotional experience, potentially, of Doll's life, right? So there's just so much depth to this chapter. Obviously, I'm struggling to even kind of concisely articulate it. But I'll stop there because this is already longer, right, than most of my lectures are, and that I want them to be. I hope that you find this book as fascinating and illuminating as I do. I hope you find it a little complicated and confusing, because it just is, right? Because real life is complicated and confusing. And one thing I really love is on the author's website, actually, on Taya Miles' website, there's a quote about how this is a story of a quintessentially American family. And I just love that description, because to me it really gets that, again, this idea of American studies is that, when you first think of a quintessentially American society, my default at least would be, right, white family, straight family, man, woman, couple kids, right? And no, here, right, Miles is saying, well, here's a quintessentially American family in which it's, right, a Cherokee man and enslaved black women and their children, who are sort of mixed Cherokee black children, living, right, not even under US law, but Cherokee tribal law. And that's an American family too, right? So as usual, your reflections and discussion board posts are due Sunday by midnight. And don't forget to answer both questions in your reflections. So the first question that we've been answering all semester, and then the second question about intersectionality. I'll see you guys next week.